In this episode, we're going to take a topic that sounds dry on the surface, documentation, and show why it is one of the most practical security tools you can build, especially in environments that handle payment data. When people hear policy or standards, they sometimes imagine thick binders that nobody reads. But the truth is that clear documentation is what turns good intentions into repeatable behavior. A policy explains what the organization believes and requires at a high level. A standard explains the specific rules that must be followed, and a procedure explains the exact steps people are expected to carry out in real work. If those pieces are missing or confusing, security becomes a collection of personal opinions, and that makes systems inconsistent and hard to defend. Clear, enforceable documents also reduce arguments, because they give a shared reference point when people disagree about what should be done. By the end, you should be able to explain the difference between policies, standards, and procedures, why enforceability matters, and what makes documentation actually usable by real people. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To begin, it helps to understand why documentation matters in security even when you have good technology. Security controls are not only tools and systems. They are also decisions people make, like how accounts are created, who approves access, how changes are reviewed, and what happens when something suspicious appears. If those decisions are not documented, then they depend on memory, tribal knowledge, and whoever happens to be working that day. That creates gaps when new employees join, when teams rotate, or when a crisis happens and people are stressed. In a payment environment, inconsistent practices are risky because they can expose cardholder data or weaken protections without anyone noticing right away. Documentation also supports accountability because it makes it clear who owns what responsibilities and what outcomes are expected. A common misconception is that documentation is only for auditors, but really it is for the organization itself, so it can operate safely even when people change. When documents are written clearly, they reduce mistakes, speed up onboarding, and make security operations more predictable. Now let's separate the three main types of documents, because beginners often mix them together. A policy is the top-level statement of intent and expectation, like a rule of the road for the entire organization. It answers questions like what is required, why it matters, and who is responsible for compliance, without describing every detail of implementation. A standard takes that policy and makes it specific, like setting minimum password requirements, required logging retention, approved encryption approaches, or how systems must be segmented. A procedure turns the standard into an operational recipe, describing how a task is done from start to finish, such as how to request access, how to approve it, and how to review it over time. You can think of policy as the destination, standards as the guardrails, and procedures as the step-by-step route people actually take. When these are blended together, people get confused about what is mandatory versus what is guidance, and confusion becomes risk. Clear separation makes documents easier to maintain because you can update a procedure without rewriting the policy, and you can tighten a standard without changing the basic intent. The word enforceable is crucial because a document that cannot be enforced is basically a suggestion, and suggestions do not reliably protect sensitive environments. Enforceability starts with clarity, meaning the document uses unambiguous language that tells people what must happen. Terms like should and may are often too soft for requirements, while must and required communicate a true obligation. Enforceability also requires scope, meaning the document states who it applies to and what systems or activities it covers, so people cannot claim it did not apply to them. Another part of enforceability is measurability, meaning you can tell whether the requirement is being met, such as whether logs are retained for a stated period or whether access reviews happen on schedule. If a requirement cannot be measured, it becomes difficult to prove compliance or identify gaps. For payment environments, enforceability supports consistency, which is what protects cardholder data over time. Beginners should recognize that enforceability is not about punishment. It is about ensuring important rules are clear enough to follow and verify. Good documentation also depends on ownership, because documents without owners tend to become outdated and ignored. Ownership means someone is responsible for keeping the document accurate, reviewing it periodically, and approving updates when the environment changes. It also means the document has a place in the organization's governance process, where changes are tracked and communicated. Without ownership, procedures drift away from reality, and then people stop trusting them because they no longer match how work is actually done. A practical document also includes version control, meaning you can tell which version is current and what changed, so there is no confusion when multiple copies exist. Beginners often underestimate how damaging outdated documentation can be because it can cause people to follow steps that no longer apply, leading to security gaps or operational failures. In payment environments, outdated documents can also create a false sense of safety, where everyone believes a control exists because it is written down, even though it is no longer practiced. When ownership and review are built in, documentation becomes a living system rather than a one-time deliverable. Writing clearly is its own skill, and in security documentation, clarity is not about sounding impressive. It is about being understood the same way by different people. Clear documents avoid jargon when possible, define terms that might be misunderstood, and use consistent language throughout. If you use a term like sensitive data in one place and regulated data in another, people may assume they mean different things even if you intended the same meaning. Clarity also means stating required actions in simple sentences that can be followed without interpretation. A helpful technique is to write requirements as if you are explaining them to someone new on their first day, because if a beginner can understand it, experienced staff can too. Another technique is to include purpose statements that explain why the rule exists, because people follow rules better when they understand the reason, especially when the rule creates friction. However, the purpose should not turn into a long story. It should stay focused on the risk it addresses. For beginners, the lesson is that the best security documentation reads like plain instructions, not like a legal contract. Policies and standards should also align with real workflows, because documents that ignore reality will be bypassed. For example, if a standard requires approvals that are impossible to obtain quickly, people will invent shortcuts, and those shortcuts will be inconsistent and risky. If a procedure requires steps that do not match the tools and processes teams actually use, people will stop consulting the document and rely on memory. A good approach is to document what the organization intends to do, then validate that it is feasible, and then adjust the document to reflect a process that people can actually follow. This does not mean lowering security requirements. It means designing secure processes that fit operational constraints. In payment environments, this alignment is especially important because the cardholder data environment is often connected to business-critical systems, and overly rigid rules can cause friction that leads to shadow processes. Beginners should understand that a secure organization is not one with the strictest documents, but one with documents that create consistent, realistic, secure behavior. When documentation matches the way work is done, compliance becomes normal behavior rather than a special event. Another feature of effective documentation is having clear connections between documents, so people can navigate from high-level intent to actionable steps. A policy might state that access must be controlled and reviewed, and the standards might define how often reviews occur and what types of accounts require special handling. The procedure then describes how managers conduct the review, how exceptions are handled, and how results are recorded. If these documents are disconnected, people will read one and not know where to find the next piece, which leads to incomplete compliance. Connection also helps in change management, because when a policy changes, you can identify which standards and procedures need updates, rather than missing a dependency. This is particularly important when dealing with payment requirements, where changes in scope or technology can affect multiple controls at once. Beginners can think of this as a chain, where breaking one link weakens the whole structure. When documents reference each other thoughtfully, they become a system that supports learning and consistent execution. Exceptions and compensating controls are another area where documentation must be precise, because real environments sometimes cannot meet a requirement in the standard way. An exception process explains how someone can request a temporary deviation, who approves it, how risk is assessed, and how the exception is tracked and revisited. Without an exception process, people will still create exceptions, but they will do it informally, and informal exceptions are hard to track and often become permanent. A compensating control is an alternative safeguard that provides similar protection when the original requirement cannot be met, but it must be documented clearly so it is not confused with simply doing less. For beginners, the important point is that exceptions should not be secret, and they should not be based on convenience. They should be controlled decisions with accountability. Documentation makes that accountability possible by recording the justification and the time window. In payment environments, exception discipline matters because weak controls can become the path attackers use, especially when everyone assumes temporary means safe. Clear documentation ensures exceptions are handled as managed risk, not as quiet drift. Training and communication are tightly linked to documentation because documents only protect you if people know they exist and understand what they require. That means policies, standards, and procedures should be introduced during onboarding, refreshed periodically, and reinforced during relevant work moments, such as when someone is given privileged access or when a new system is deployed. It also means documents should be accessible, meaning stored in a place people can find, with clear naming and organization. A common failure is storing security documentation in a location only a small team can access, which forces others to ask for help or guess, and guessing creates inconsistency. Another failure is publishing documents but never confirming they were understood, which leads to a checkbox mentality. A more effective approach is to connect documentation to role-specific training so that people learn the parts relevant to their responsibilities and can apply them immediately. Beginners should see documentation as a teaching tool, not just a rulebook, because clear procedures help people perform tasks correctly. When documents and training reinforce each other, secure behavior becomes easier to sustain. Review and improvement are the final pieces that turn documentation into a durable system. Security documentation should be reviewed on a regular schedule, but it should also be reviewed when big changes happen, like new payment flows, new vendors, major incidents, or changes in technology. Feedback loops matter, meaning if teams find a procedure confusing or unrealistic, that feedback should lead to an update rather than being ignored. Incident lessons are particularly valuable because they reveal where procedures were unclear, where responsibilities were ambiguous, or where standards did not match reality. Reviews should also check for consistency, such as whether terms match across documents and whether policy statements are actually supported by standards and procedures. Beginners should understand that documentation is never truly finished because environments change and attackers adapt, but that does not make documentation pointless. It makes it necessary to keep it current. When documentation is maintained, it becomes a trusted guide that helps teams operate securely with less confusion and fewer mistakes. A well-run documentation program is not static compliance. It is operational maturity. As we wrap up, the central idea is that clear documentation of policies, standards, and enforceable procedures is one of the most effective ways to turn security goals into consistent daily practice. Policies state the organization's intent and expectations. Standards define specific mandatory rules, and procedures give people the steps to follow in real work without guessing. Enforceability comes from clarity, scope, and measurability, and it is supported by ownership, version control, and regular review so documents stay aligned with reality. When documentation is written in plain language, connected across levels, and integrated into training, it becomes something people actually use rather than something they avoid. Exception handling and compensating controls must be documented carefully so risk is managed openly instead of drifting silently. In payment environments, where protecting cardholder data depends on consistent behavior, documentation is a stabilizer that keeps controls reliable over time. The most important lesson for a new learner is that good security documentation is not about writing more pages. It is about writing the right words, clearly enough that the organization can follow them, prove them, and improve them.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.